Hi everybody, Johnny here. I'm going to be going through CalTPA Cycle 2, Step 4 Apply, and this is from the Performance Assessment Guide from the fall of 2019. So let's get started. Step 4 is all about using your assessment results that you analyze in Step 3 to set out and organize either a reteaching lesson for the students who did not yet meet your learning goals, or an extension activity for your students who exceeded your expectations for learning goal in your prior learning segment. All right? So let's go through this together. First part, apply. Based on your analysis of assessment results from steps 2 and 3, and this is from all of the different kinds of assessments results. This is informal, student self-assessment, and formal assessment. Identify this type of specific follow activity. So this is, they say activity. So you can imagine this being some kind of, it could be a lesson, 20, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, whatever, but it's an activity. So you want to think about it as targeted. You're not trying to teach all things. You're trying to address, if you're reteaching, you're trying to address some specific need that you found quite plainly in your analysis of the assessments. Okay? So it's appropriate for the next step of learning for the whole class or a group of students. Okay, you could choose either one. If you found one strand of misunderstandings amongst your whole class, then you might want to have a targeted lesson on that misunderstanding for your whole class. Most folks will probably be working with a group of students who had struggles with a particular piece of the learning segment or a particular set of learning goals that you set out in the original teaching. So you might do something really targeted for a group of students that you're basing this activity on, and it's all structured around something special that you've identified in your analysis of the assessments. All right? So there's two choices: reteaching for those students who did not meet the content-specific learning goals. You want to provide, and this is the big piece, a new approach to instruction to support their continued progress. The other choice is an extension activity. If students met or exceeded the content-specific learning goals, connect or apply instruction to develop new learning by building on, really hold on to this one, building on what your students were able to demonstrate during the learning segment. Okay, this is going beyond where you were with the learning segment, but you also want to make sure it's quite clearly based and founded in what your students showed you already. Based on these things that they showed me in the learning segment, I'm going to take them above and beyond because they showed me these things, right? So let's look at what I've written here. So you have a choice. My first one says, reteach, work with those students you identified through your assessment who need targeted teaching. I'm going to use the word targeted here. You want to be very specific. In a different form. So this is the part where we talk about a new approach. You cannot teach the same lesson again, hoping that having seen it twice, the students will now get it. You will need to vary what you're doing. You must be a new approach. And my suggestions for you are just to step back and think about how you went about the first segment or the first learning sequence. Were there ways in which ideas were represented to students that can be varied? Okay, maybe it was a particular text you used. Maybe you need to use a different text. Maybe some representation you used, maybe a different kind of representation to use. You might have kids, instead of it being you giving talk from the front, you might have kids read through something and discuss it. You want to shift the kind of teaching to a different kind of teaching that gets to those kids who weren't able to work through it and get the most out of the original way you went about it. It has to be different. The next piece, extension. You want to work with those students you identified as exceeding learning expectations on your assessment in an approach, and this is my suggestion, in an approach that builds on what these students have shown you. And so some ways to think about it: you can push deeper learning on the topic. You can extend the topic to a more complex set of ideas. Or another way to do this is to connect to other kinds of learning in other places. These are all good ways to extend what's going further. The other piece that you might do is look at your essential questions, and based on what your students have done, come up with a deeper question, a different essential question that becomes the focus of this learning activity, one that makes students reach a bit further and deeper. All right? Okay, so let's look at this section here in the green box. Important notice. In both types of instruction, if both types of instruction are applicable for the whole class or group of students, select one type to teach for the content-specific follow-up activity. You must provide evidence. This is our favorite thing here in these two steps. You must provide evidence for your decision based on the actual student data collected in steps 2 and 3. You have to give good reason. All right? That goes back to citing evidence. The reason to be reteaching is, I saw these things in my students' assessments. I saw this in the informal assessment. I saw this in their self-assessment. I saw this in the formal assessment. In the video, you can see. Okay, you have to give good evidence for why you're choosing to do reteaching or extension. All right. And their example here. For example, if one learning goal of your instructional segment taught during this cycle was met but another was not, choose the one goal not yet met to reteach the content in a new way to provide additional support and opportunity to learn to your students. If your students did demonstrate that they met the learning goals, design an activity that will give students the opportunity to extend beyond the learning goal, okay, and deepen or advance their understanding of the content-specific learning goals. All right? Okay, so important. You must justify your choice of students and choice to reteach or extend based on evidence from the assessments. Cite evidence, big deal. It shows up in the rubrics again and again and again. What's your reason for choosing to reteach? What's your reason for choosing to extend? Evidence from the assessments, evidence from your videos. Show why you're choosing to do this. Okay. And the other thing is, when you cite that evidence, if you can pull specific examples from the student work and specific scores from your rubrics, those things are all solid evidence. All right. Let's continue. You can see the activity is reteaching or extension activity, and we'll go on to the next page where it goes 2 through 7 about other considerations. Okay, so let's continue. Number 1 was reteach or extend. Okay. Number 2, whole class or small group. All right. So whole class or small group, have a good reason why. Whole class should be done if all students need reteaching, unlikely possibilities that they all need extending. But if there's one particular piece, one learning goal when you do your analysis where none of your students did well on that, if you look at your table and you see none of my students did well by this particular learning goal, then you have reason to do the whole class, right? When you do your analysis in part 3 and you find a cluster of kids did not do well by one particular learning goal, that's the one you want to target for reteaching for a small group. My thought is that most folks are going to be working with a small group based on one particular learning goal from the rubrics that you analyzed in step 3. All right? Okay. So based on that, you need to define what the learning goal is, and you might say why that particular learning goal. All right? Okay. So number 4, brief description of the activity. And it starts with educational technology, but let's put that last. You want to be describing how this learning activity will develop or extend students' deep understanding of the content, and here's an and, develop academic language. Whenever there's an and, you need to make sure you're doing both. So let's do this way. Must include for number 4. Of the ones so far, number 4 is a thick one. This is the one that's going to matter a whole lot on the rubric scoring as well. Okay, so I wrote focus on how this activity will better students' understanding, whether they need the reteaching or the extension. Include description of how you will push for deep understanding and how academic language will matter. So 2 parts here, deep understanding and academic language. Make sure you address both. And then this is my little bit. I think you should then that's the place after you've done those things, then think about where the technology fits. They put technology first, but number 4 is not about educational technology. Number 4 really is about developing and extending students' understandings. So start with that. How will they better understand the content based on what this activity will do? What's this activity going to do for your students? And then where technology fits in. Okay. Next piece, number 5. Rationale for choosing this content-specific learning activity. All right. And this is the part where you say why you're doing this activity based on your analysis of all these things. All right. I'm choosing to do this activity because my students showed me in their assessments here, here, and here, okay, that they needed a deeper understanding or revisiting or a new approach to understanding this. Okay. So I wrote, you must justify why you chose this activity, cite evidence. Big deal. Cite evidence, cite evidence, cite evidence. Use your assessment data as evidence. Number 6, what informal assessments are you going to undertake during this activity to check for student understanding? And they give you examples of questions, observation notes, processes. Okay? And then they got an and here. You want to be paying attention. Your informal assessment should address both their understandings and their use of academic language. All right? And what I wrote here, describe your informal assessments. You might say what questions, how you'll walk around, the discussion you might use to check for student understanding, any polls you might make. What needs to be here also is academic language. So make sure that number 6, you're also talking in your informal assessments how you are going to be paying attention to students' use of language related to the content. Number 7, any instructional adaptations or accommodations to the activity to allow all students to access and engage in deep learning and demonstrate their understanding of the content and use of academic language again. Okay. CalTPA works from the UDL framework, Universal Design for Learning framework, and this is all about thinking about how you set things up in different ways or make different opportunities for kids to access the content, to engage the content, and to represent their understandings. Okay, so no one thing fits for everybody. You want to make sure there's some spaces. These adaptations or accommodations should be based on what you know about your students. Okay, so as I wrote here, this is where you show that you know your students and how to organize instruction so that all students have access to the core ideas. Okay, so you might describe some students as needing, based on my work with these 3 students, I know that this is what I should do to help them do well within this activity. These other 4 students, we may try this approach instead because of how they go about their learning or some particular need or interest. So those are all about the adaptations and accommodations. What I suggest here is vary the way you present. Okay, not one size fits all. Think about talk and visuals. Vary how students engage. Instead of it just being teacher talk where you talk to them and they respond, think about partner work, group work. Also think about varying the tools and manipulatives they might use. In the initial lesson that you did before this reteaching or extension lesson, maybe for the reteaching or extension lesson, you're getting different sets of tools for students to learn, different manipulatives for the math, different prompts for the reading, different texts for the reading. What's the difference you're doing this time around to make it so that it's accessible and possible for your students to be successful? So that's number 7. Okay. So number 2, teach and video record the follow-up instruction. And this is just very practical. Teach and video record the entire follow-up reteaching And as a rule, you're recording every bit of every lesson you teach for CalTPA. All right. And then you want to select and annotate one video clip, and I'm sorry to say you only get 5 minutes here, that demonstrates your follow-up instruction. Now we get to the parts that matter. Okay. And the video clip should, and this is pretty evident, demonstrate a key section of the content-specific instruction. And, okay, so obviously it's going to be about the content that you'd set out for your original segment, but in a new and interesting way, either to reteach or extend. And then if we go to number 2, provide evidence of either. And well, let's talk about these. For the reteaching activity, how the instruction during the activity differs from previous instruction to develop content knowledge. And of course, academic language. Whenever they throw academic language in, make sure you're doing that too. Content knowledge and academic language. Content knowledge and academic language. If you're doing the extension activity, you want to be connecting to what they know. And as I said before, this is the important part for both, but especially for the extension activity, CalTPA is looking for how you're connecting and working from what students already know. Make that plain in your teaching. That's probably how you should start off your extension teaching. Last week we did this wonderful thing and you all showed me how you thought about this. So-and-so did this kind of approach to this problem, or we read so-and-so's essay on such and such and such and such, and she did such a wonderful job. And 3 of you also wrote about this too, so you're connecting to what they've already done and working from that. Okay? And then you want to extend and deepen. Okay, and then it's again about both. It says content knowledge and academic language. As I've said more than once now, you need to do both. Content knowledge, academic language. Make sure both are given attention. So here's what I wrote about the reteach and extension lessons. Your video must clearly show that your instruction is different from the teaching you did in the main learning sequence. And you need to show that this new approach will change students' content knowledge. Okay, so you want, the big idea here is in the reteaching, the students after this activity will be different than they were before the activity. They will understand or better understand or be able to do things that they couldn't do before this lesson, you know, and they didn't show you in the original sequence, all right? And remember, it's both about understanding of content and academic language. For the extension, your video must show how your students connect their prior learning to deeper, richer, extended understandings of the topic. So connect is a big word here. Connect, connect, connect. There is an and, so give attention to academic language again. And it will matter throughout this extension activity. This might be a core thing within an extension activity or with the reteaching too. And one way to think about it, both for the reteaching and for the extension, is to think about how that language, academic language, is a tool to deepen understanding. How does language do good work for us to understand content better, but also to extend or deepen our understandings, all right? So what kinds of language, terms, ways of saying things, text, etc., help us to get deeper into our understanding of the learning goals of the content, all right? So one last piece. Okay. And this is very similar to what you did earlier in the initial segment, which is you're going to have video from this. You're recording the entire extension or reteaching activity, and then you need to do something with it. Okay, so let's go through this piece. In the green box, when you upload your video file for submission, you will be required to assign a label to your file indicating the type of activity in the video clip. The system will prompt you to either select reteaching activity or extension activity. During the upload process, make sure you have appropriate label the type of activity you are uploading and that it matches your written narrative. So make sure if it's reteaching, you label it reteaching. And make sure if it's extension, you're labeling extension. Okay? The part that matters most here, and this is the part that's going to be significant to your scoring, is the annotation. How you're annotating your video. And it's a bit different than the annotations you do for the main sequence. So let's let's be careful with this one, all right? Your annotation is a brief text explanation you provide that is associated with a specific point in the video clip, the where. Your annotation must include the following annotation title, to label your explanation, the what, and a brief rationale. This is your writing about what's going on. This is the place where you show what you know and convince the evaluators that you understand the purposes and the worth of this activity and how your students are learning. Okay? And a brief rationale explaining the activity you chose to teach. All right, so let's go through this. The annotation is going to be, annotation title will be follow-up instruction. The brief rationale, there are two parts. A, for reteaching, where and how you retaught the content in a new or different way. So the emphasis is on difference, okay? And you must give it rationale. You need to say why, okay, you retaught it that way. Why'd you make those choices? It says where and how, but I'm going to suggest you also say why. I chose to reteach this in this way because in the initial teaching, my students weren't able to quite do this, okay? For the next part, for the extension activity, again, where and how you extended student learning beyond the learning goal, okay? And you might also, again, describe the why, what the choices you made for that teaching, and why that teaching and activity went that way in order to extend students' learning. Here's what I wrote, and I'm going to say that you should do more. I'm going to say that this here, these two, are a bit limiting in the way they describe them, but you need to be smart about using annotations to push your vision, your understanding, or your representation of your teaching. So you really want to work these. Don't be shy about annotating things. Just make sure they're appropriate. Don't annotate haphazardly, but whenever there's a moment that you can say something about your reteaching or extension that makes clear why you made the choices you did, or what you're seeing in the teaching, or what the students are doing that makes good sense for the reteaching or the extension, then you need to annotate that. So let's make sure we get all of these. First off, annotate your video. The first thing is use the marker, follow-up instruction. Okay, that's the annotation. You only have one for this. Just use it. Use it a lot in good ways, all right? My suggestions. Use these annotations to describe how and why. Okay? Their explanation was always where and how. I'm going to say why as well. You changed instruction. Use these annotations to describe how and why you changed instruction, and the changed part has to be evident for the reteaching, right? To effect change in students' understanding, whether reteaching or extending, so you can do this for either of them, okay? Your students' understandings are going to be changed because of this activity. You chose this activity and you're teaching in this way, and this is why you believe and how you see in your video that understandings are being changed. Next piece, use these annotations to mark where academic language mattered. Let's put another one underneath it. You remember beforehand, it was always about content and academic language. If you focus solely on content, you're going to miss the academic language part. Always content, academic language. Content, academic language. And your annotation should have always two parts to it. In this clip, you can see our content understandings are being pushed by. You can see students using academic language to explain. So every single one of your annotations, if you're smart, if you're capable, if it's possible, please say something about content understandings, but also about academic language. It's always the two. The next piece. Use these annotations to mark where you drew upon and worked from students' prior knowledge. I'm going to suggest this for both. Okay. This is especially important in the extension activity. In the extension activity, they keep saying connect to students' prior learning, connect to students' prior learning. So you need to make sure you use the annotations to talk about that too. So you can imagine in your extension lesson that the first 3 or 4 minutes are just talking about what was learned before. This is where you're connecting to prior learning, and that's the starting place for extending their learning. All right? The last one, use these annotations to justify your choice for the activity. I'm going to say cite evidence from your prior assessments. So you can say in the video, you can see that now I am going to be using these tools here to demonstrate such and such and such and such. I'm doing this because I saw in my students' work before, in my assessments, I saw that they did this, this, and this. So I decided to do this in a different way. I'm going to use a different set of tools, manipulatives, prompts, texts, whatever it is. So justify your choice for the activity within these annotations too. So my last take on this with the annotations, they don't ask much of the annotations, but you really need to work the annotations to tell your story of why you chose to do the reteaching or the extension and how you're going about it and what good things are happening for your kids as a result of your choices. And you want to give evidence for why you chose to do the reteaching or the extension, but also for your teacher moves, the things that you're doing with the kids as well. The piece that's not missing, that's also missing here, I'm just realizing this, you might also annotate, and I'll just put this in. Let's see what we got here. Let's just remember informal assessment. I'm just realizing this. It doesn't say anything about it here in terms of the annotation, but that was one of the requirements for this reteaching or the extension lesson. How are you going to be using informal assessment? Make sure that whatever points at which you in your lesson you're doing informal assessment, you stop and you annotate that. Okay, you can imagine at this point I am doing a check for understanding to see whether it's time to move on to this next question or not. I could see from my students that I needed to restate this or whatever. So wherever you can imagine informal assessment showing up too. All right? That way you're describing your good teaching and the purposefulness of your teaching. All right. So that's step 4 from CalTPA Cycle 2. And I do hope this has been useful for you.